accused of
I was accused of
stealing...
stealing items from Diana, Princess of Wales, things that she had given to me.
Yes.
And I'd explained to the Queen at Buckingham Palace shortly after the Princess's death that I would not stand by and let everyone else change history.
But Meghan Markle is so delusional. She is so self-impressed that she just does it naturally.
For years, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have presented themselves as a united couple. But now, one question continues to hang over everything surrounding them. What would actually happen if their marriage ended? There has been no official announcement confirming a divorce, but speculation about problems inside the relationship has continued to attract attention. And if Harry and Meghan ever did reach the point of separation, this would not be an ordinary celebrity divorce. There would be children involved, major financial interests, businesses, property, public reputations, and a family legacy that could make the entire situation far more complicated, because sitting right in the middle of this hypothetical divorce is something much more emotional than money. Princess Diana's jewelry. Harry gave Meghan pieces connected to his late mother, including the engagement ring containing diamonds associated with Diana, along with other Diana-linked pieces that Meghan has worn publicly. So if the marriage ever ended, would Harry be able to get those pieces back? Would Meghan have the right to keep them? Or could Diana's jewelry become one of the biggest bargaining points in a future divorce settlement? That is the question that makes this story so much bigger than a simple breakup. First, it is important to separate what is known from what is being speculated. Harry and Meghan have not publicly confirmed that they are getting divorced. The discussion surrounding their marriage comes from reports, commentary, public observations, and claims about possible marital strain. Some commentators have pointed toward disagreements involving money, family priorities, and the pressures surrounding their lives. Others have interpreted changes in their public appearances or statements as evidence of tension. But none of those things by themselves proves that a divorce is coming. A marriage can go through difficult periods without ending. At the same time, when speculation continues for a long period and more questions begin appearing around the same relationship, the public naturally starts asking what would happen if those rumors eventually became reality. And in Harry and Meghan's case, the consequences of a divorce would extend far beyond the two of them. One of the biggest issues would be money. A divorce between two people with a complicated public and financial life can become extremely difficult because there is no simple way to separate everything they built together. Harry and Meghan have developed businesses, media relationships, charitable activities, commercial interests, and a public brand that has often been built around them as a couple. If they were ever to separate, lawyers would potentially have to examine what belongs to whom, which interests were created individually, which were created together, and how future earnings should be handled. The original script repeatedly connects the alleged marital problems with financial pressure, suggesting that money has become an important part of the tension surrounding their situation. Whether every financial prediction being discussed publicly proves accurate is impossible to know, but the basic issue is undeniable. Maintaining two separate lives can be considerably more complicated and expensive than maintaining one shared household. And that is where the hypothetical divorce becomes particularly interesting. Imagine that Harry and Meghan were no longer living as a married couple. Suddenly there could be two households instead of one, two sets of expenses, separate legal costs, separate professional teams, separate travel arrangements, separate security considerations. And if their business interests were divided, there could be questions about future contracts and who controls projects that were originally associated with the couple. Their financial situation would not simply be a matter of taking everything they own and splitting it down the middle. Different assets could have different histories and different legal treatment. Some things might be jointly owned, some might belong to one person, some could be connected to businesses, and some could be emotionally priceless, despite having a clearly measurable financial value. Then there are their children, Archie and Lilibet. This is arguably the most important part of any potential divorce discussion, because children change everything. If Harry and Meghan separated, they would still have to remain connected through their children. There would be questions about parenting schedules, education, travel, privacy, security, and how the children maintain relationships with both parents. A divorce agreement would therefore have to address much more than money. It would have to create a structure for the children's lives after the marriage change. And because Harry and Meghan live under extraordinary public scrutiny, protecting their children's privacy could become one of the most difficult parts of the entire situation. The public often looks at celebrity divorce stories and immediately asks, Who will get the money? Or who will get the property? But when children are involved, those questions become secondary to a much more important issue. How do two parents continue raising their children when their relationship with each other has broken down? That question could be particularly complicated for Harry and Meghan because their children have grown up under intense media attention. Every public appearance, every family photograph, and every decision involving them can become part of a much larger public discussion. A hypothetical divorce would therefore create another layer of pressure that most ordinary families never experience. But even with money and children involved, there is one issue that immediately grabs people's attention: Diana's jewelry. Princess Diana's jewelry has never been ordinary jewelry. Every piece associated with her carries history. It carries photographs, memories, and emotional meaning. Diana remains one of the most recognizable women in modern royal history, and objects connected to her continue to attract enormous attention decades later. For Harry, that connection is even more personal. Diana was not simply a famous royal, she was his mother. So when jewelry connected to Diana becomes part of Harry's marriage, the objects carry a completely different emotional weight. The original source specifically focuses on Diana's engagement ring, bracelets, and earrings, and argues that the absence of a publicly described prenup provision requiring their return could become important if the couple ever divorced. But that claim needs to be understood carefully. The public does not have every private agreement, document, or legal detail surrounding each individual piece, and the ownership history of jewelry can vary from one item to another. A piece could have been inherited, gifted, transferred, or acquired under different circumstances, so it would be too simplistic to say that Meghan automatically keeps everything, or that Harry automatically gets everything back. The real question is much more complicated. What was each piece? How was it transferred? And what would happen to it if the marriage ended? That distinction matters enormously when we talk about the engagement. The ring is not just a valuable piece of jewelry. It is one of the most recognizable symbols of Harry and Meghan's relationship. It is also connected to Diana because diamonds associated with her collection were incorporated into the design. That means the ring carries two histories at the same time. It represents Harry and Meghan's marriage, but it also represents Harry's relationship with his mother. If the marriage ever ended, that could make the ring emotionally complicated for both sides. Would Meghan continue to wear it? Would she remove it immediately? Would Harry want it back? Would he view it primarily as his mother's legacy rather than as a symbol of the marriage? Or would the couple simply leave the issue alone? There is no public answer to those questions, but the uncertainty itself is what makes the subject so compelling. The same applies to other Diana-linked jewelry. Meghan has worn pieces associated with Diana publicly, and those appearances have repeatedly reminded audiences of the connection between the two women. When Meghan wears a Diana-linked piece, the public doesn't just see an expensive accessory. People immediately think of Diana. They remember her photographs. They remember her relationship with Harry. They remember the royal family, and they remember the complicated history surrounding Harry and Meghan themselves. That means the jewelry has become part of a much larger emotional story, and this is where the divorce settlement question becomes interesting. The original script suggests that Harry might have to negotiate if he wanted certain pieces back, rather than simply demanding their return. That is a hypothetical scenario, not a confirmed plan, but it illustrates an important point about divorce. Emotionally important possessions can sometimes become part of broader negotiations. If one person considers an object priceless, while the other person considers it a personal gift, the disagreement can become much more complicated than simply looking at the item's market value. Imagine a hypothetical negotiation. Harry and Meghan are discussing their financial arrangements. There are assets on the table. There are business interests. There are questions involving the children. There are personal possessions. And then Harry asks about the jewelry connected to Diana. Meghan may believe that certain pieces were gifts given to her and therefore belong to her. Harry may feel that certain pieces have a special family significance that makes their return important. Their lawyers would then have to determine what can actually be claimed and what can be negotiated. That does not automatically mean the jewelry would become a battle. It could simply become one part of a much larger settlement. But because these pieces are connected to Diana, even a private negotiation could attract enormous public interest if details ever emerged. There is another reason this issue is so powerful. The emotional value of Diana's jewelry may be much greater than its financial value. A diamond has a market price. A sapphire has a market price. Gold has a market price. But a piece connected to Princess Diana carries something that cannot be purchased again. You cannot simply replace the history. You cannot recreate the photographs. You cannot recreate the fact that Diana wore the piece. And you cannot recreate Harry's personal connection to his mother. That is why the question of who keeps the jewelry could become so emotionally charged. For Meghan, the pieces may represent gifts she received during her marriage. They may also have become part of her own public identity. For Harry, they may represent his mother's memory. For the public, they represent Diana's legacy. Three different meanings can exist at the same time, and that is exactly why a hypothetical divorce could create such a strange situation. The marriage could end, but the symbols of that marriage could remain. The ring could still exist. The photographs would still exist. The jewelry would still exist. The memories would still exist. And every time one of those pieces appeared in public, people would be reminded of the relationship that once existed. That is why the jewelry question could become part of the wider narrative surrounding the divorce. But there is another major issue that cannot be ignored: Harry and Meghan's public identity. For years, their story has been told as a shared story. Their decision to step away from royal duties was presented as a joint decision. Their move to a new life was presented as something they did together. Their interviews often involved both of them. Their documentaries focused heavily on their relationship. Their commercial identity became closely associated with the idea of Harry and Meghan as a couple. If the marriage ended, both would have to redefine themselves. Harry would no longer be one half of Harry and Meghan. Meghan would no longer be one half of Harry and Meghan. That could affect their professional opportunities, as well as their public perception. Some projects might continue, others might change. Certain commercial relationships could become more difficult. Future projects could be built around their individual identities rather than their shared story. And audiences that had followed them as a couple might suddenly have to decide whether they wanted to continue following them separately. This is where a divorce could become much more than a private family matter. It could become a complete restructuring of their public lives. And there is another side to that restructuring: reputation. Harry and Meghan have one of the most polarizing public stories in the world. They have extremely loyal supporters and extremely vocal critics. If they ever divorced, people would almost immediately begin searching for someone to blame. Some would blame royal pressure. Some would blame money. Some would blame the media. Some would blame their careers. Others would blame the couple themselves. But real relationships are rarely that simple. A marriage can be affected by multiple pressures at once. Financial problems can create tension. Parenting disagreements can create tension. Career differences can create tension. Public scrutiny can amplify all of it. And when millions of people are watching, even ordinary relationship problems can become global headlines. That is why some of the more sensational claims in the original material should remain clearly identified as claims rather than facts. The script discusses allegations about relationship strain and even reports concerning possible romantic interests. But those claims are not proof that Harry and Meghan are divorcing. The strongest version of this story does not need to treat speculation as certainty. The uncertainty itself is what keeps people watching. Because the central question is not, are they definitely getting divorced? The central question is, if they ever do, what happens next? And the answer could involve a complicated financial settlement. It could involve difficult decisions about their children. It could involve the future of their business. It could involve their individual public identity. And it could involve Diana's jewel. There is also the question of what Harry would actually want after a divorce. Would he prioritize money? Would he prioritize his children? Would he prioritize his mother's? Would he want certain family items returned? Or would he simply want to move forward and avoid another public battle? Nobody can know his priorities unless he says so. But if Diana's jewelry is as emotionally significant as many people believe, it would be understandable if certain pieces mattered enormously to him. And this is where the idea of leverage comes into the discussion. The original script argues that Meghan could potentially hold negotiating leverage because of the jewelry and other aspects of the marriage. Again, that is an interpretation, not a confirmed legal strategy. It highlights how different assets can carry different importance to different people. A property might be worth millions, but a family heirloom can be worth much more emotional than its market value. If Harry desperately wanted a particular piece because it belonged to Diana, he might be willing to negotiate differently than he would over an ordinary asset. That is the part of the story so compelling, because if the marriage ever ends, the most important thing on the table might not be the most expensive. It might be the most meaningful thing. Diana's jewelry could be exactly that. There is also a misconception that divorce automatically means everything gets divided according to a simple formula. Real settlements can be far more complicated. Different jurisdictions have different rules. Gift can have different legal treatment. Inherited property can have different consideration. Jointly owned asset can be different from individually owned asset, and private agreements can change the picture entirely. That means nobody should confidently declare that Meghan will definitely keep the jewelry or Harry will definitely get it back. The only responsible conclusion is that the answer would depend on the ownership history of each piece and whatever legal arrangements existed between them. But even if the legal question were eventually settled quietly, the public debate would probably continue. Because Diana's jewelry is not just property, it is symbol. It connects Harry to his mother, it connects Meghan to Harry, and it connects both of them to a royal history that remains intensely fascinating to millions of people. That symbolism would make any future divorce settlement much more emotionally powerful. Now consider the financial side. The original source describes Harry as facing significant financial pressure and argues that a divorce could make that situation even more difficult. Even without accepting every prediction about his future income, the basic reality is that separation creates additional costs. Lawyers have to be paid. New living arrangements may be required. Children's expenses continue. Existing businesses may need restructuring. And two separate lifestyles can cost considerably more than one. That means Harry and Meghan would potentially have strong reasons to negotiate rather than fight endlessly over every individual item. A settlement could allow both sides to move forward, but the emotional question of Diana's jewelry could make that settlement much harder. Would Harry accept a financial trade in exchange for getting certain pieces back? Would Meghan agree? Would some pieces remain with her while others return to Harry? Would they simply decide that the issue wasn't worth the fight? There is no way to know. And perhaps that's why the question keeps returning. Because unlike money, jewelry can carry memory. A bank account can be divided. A house can be sold. A business can be restructured. But you cannot divide a memory of Princess Diana into two equal pieces. And that is ultimately what makes this hypothetical divorce story so powerful. If Harry and Meghan never divorce, then none of these questions will ever have to be answered. But if they do, the jewelry could become a symbol of everything that has been lost, everything that remains, and everything that still connects Harry to the family history he came from. So the question isn't simply whether Harry gets a ring back. The real question is what happens when a marriage ends, but the emotional history behind it cannot be divided. Harry could walk away with money. Meghan could walk away with money. They could divide business interests. They could establish arrangements for their children. They could build separate careers. But Diana's jewelry would remain something different. It would still carry her name. It would still carry Harry's memories. And it would still carry the history of the relationship between Harry and Meghan. That is why, if a divorce ever becomes official, people may watch the jewelry almost as closely as they watch the financial settlement itself. And there is one final point worth remembering. The public may want a simple winner and loser. But a divorce involving children, money, businesses, and family heirlooms rarely produces such a clean ending. Harry could lose part of the life he built with Meghan. Meghan could lose part of the future she expected. Their children could have to adjust to a completely different family structure. And both would have to live with the public attention that follows every decision. So perhaps the better question isn't, who wins? Perhaps the question is, what does each person have to give up to build a new life? And if Harry truly values Diana's jewelry as part of his mother's legacy, then those pieces could become one of the most important parts of that negotiation. At the moment, however, this remains hypothetical. There is no confirmed Harry and Meghan divorce announcement, and there is no confirmed public divorce settlement involving Diana's jewelry. What exists is a collection of reports, speculation, and questions about what could happen if their marriage ever reached that point. But those questions are enough to keep the story alive. Because the money is interesting, the children are important, the businesses matter, the public image matters, but the jewelry is personal. And if Harry and Meghan ever do separate, the question of what happens to Princess Diana's jewelry could become one of the most emotionally charged parts of the entire story. If Harry and Meghan ever divorce, should Diana's jewelry go back to Harry because of its connection to his mother? Or should Meghan keep the pieces that were given to her during their marriage? Could the jewelry become part of a larger financial settlement? Or would Harry simply walk away, rather than turn his mother's legacy into another public dispute? Whatever happens, one thing is certain. If this marriage ever reaches its final chapter, the story will not end with a divorce announcement. It will continue through the children, the money, the businesses, the public reaction, and perhaps most importantly, the objects that carry the memories of the people who came before them. And among all of those objects, Diana's jewelry may be the one thing that cannot be replaced, cannot be forgotten, and cannot simply be treated like another line on a financial spreadsheet. Because if Harry and Meghan ever do divorce, the biggest question may not be what Harry gets from Meghan, but what part of his mother's legacy he can still take with him. Let me know in the comments, and if you want to follow this story as it develops, subscribe for the next update.